The Tennessee Supreme Court has set an execution date for Christa Pike. The court granted the state's motion after ruling Pike had exhausted her and presented no extenuating circumstances for commutation. Pike was sentenced to the death for the 1995 murder of Colleen Slemmer and remains the only woman on Tennessee's death row.
They hacked and cut and slashed.
Authorities say she was then beaten over the head with a large chunk of asphalt from this pile.
There was 2 pentagrams carved on her.
The last thing Colleen Slemmer heard before the darkness closed in was the sound of her own blood splattering against the cold ground, her life slipping away, while her killers stood over her, eerily calm, as if they'd just completed a twisted ritual. It was January 12th, 1995, a night that would change Knoxville, Tennessee forever. A teenage girl, filled with rage and jealousy, had decided that Colleen, a 19-year-old student just beginning her life, had to be silenced. What started as a casual walk soon turned into a brutal, premeditated act of violence. Christa Pike, with the help of her accomplices, would not just take Colleen's life. They would mark it with symbols of control and obsession. As Colleen lay on the cold ground, her fate had already been sealed by a mixture of delusion, trauma, and a chilling desire for power. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I will take you through the timeline of the life of Christa Pike, one of the most chilling cases in the history of the US death row. We'll begin by uncovering her troubled past and how it led her down a dark path. Then, we'll dive into the shocking crime that forever altered the course of her life. Following that, we'll explore the intense investigation and the key evidence that brought her to trial. Finally, we'll cover the courtroom drama, the trial's outcome, and the lasting implications of her case. But before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Drop a comment below. If you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more true crime stories like this one. And if you're not ready to subscribe yet, that's okay. We'd love for you to let us know in the comments how we can improve so we can continue bringing you the best content possible. Christa Pike's life began in a home marked by instability. Born in March 1976, she was raised in an environment where love and security were scarce. Her father was absent, and her mother, struggling with alcoholism, wasn't able to provide the structure Christa needed. The one stable influence in her early life was her maternal grandmother. But when she passed away, Christa's world became even more chaotic. Thrust back into her mother's care, Christa faced a life of uncertainty and emotional turmoil. By the time she was a teenager, Christa had already fallen into a cycle of neglect and emotional distress. She turned to drugs, petty crime, and rebellion as ways to cope with the overwhelming challenges she faced. Juvenile detention centers became familiar, and by then, Christa had already experienced the deep scars of trauma. Diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, she was unable to manage her emotions or find a stable sense of self. Her violent outbursts and unstable relationships grew more frequent as she sought to control her environment in any way she could. In 1994, Christa enrolled in the Knoxville Job Corps program, hoping to leave behind the wreckage of her past and build a better future. But instead of finding peace, she found chaos once more. At Job Course, she became involved with Tad Shipp, another student who shared her troubled past. Tad had an obsession with the occult and dark rituals, and his influence over Christa deepened. What began as a shared interest quickly grew into something more dangerous. For Christa, this relationship became about control and power, things she had never experienced in her chaotic life. Tad Ship wasn't just a partner, he was a figure of intense fascination for Christa, and together they fed each other's unhealthy obsessions. His views on the occult and his delusions of power pulled Christa deeper into a world of dangerous thinking. The couple shared ideas of domination, often discussing the power they could wield over others. Their conversations blurred the lines between fantasy and reality, and Christa became more willing to act on these delusions. Shadala Peterson, another Job Corps student, became part of this dark circle. Her role in the crime was ambiguous, though she was present during the event. She would later testify in the trial, providing crucial details that painted a picture of the group's dynamic. Then there was Colleen Slemmer, a 19-year-old student from Jacksonville, Florida, who had enrolled in the Job Corps to pursue her own dreams. She wasn't involved in the chaos surrounding Christa, Tad, and Shadala. Colleen had come to the center with no criminal history, hoping to improve her future through education and hard work. She had dreams of a career in technology and a life far removed from the turmoil that defined Christa's existence. But for Christa, Colleen became a threat, not because of anything Colleen had done, but because Christa's mind became consumed with the idea that Colleen was interfering with her relationship with Tad. What began as a quiet jealousy grew into a dangerous obsession. Christa became convinced that Colleen was trying to get closer to Tad, a thought that spiraled out of control. Christa believed that Colleen was trying to steal something from her, her place in Tad's life, and she couldn't stand the idea of losing that control. Colleen, unaware of Christa's growing paranoia, continued her life at Job Corps. She wasn't interested in drama and had no idea the danger was closing in. She simply wanted to make something of herself, something that Christa, with her deep-seated emotional turmoil, could never understand. On January 12, 1995, Christa, Tad, and Shadala invited Colleen to take a walk with them. What started as a simple request soon turned into an act that would change their lives forever. Christa, consumed by jealousy and irrational fears, confronted Colleen. The conversation quickly turned hostile. Christa accused Colleen of flirting with Tad, an accusation that had no basis in reality. As the tension escalated, Colleen found herself in an impossible situation. She tried to walk away, but Christa's obsession wouldn't allow it. At that moment, Colleen's life was spiraling out of control. Christa, consumed by jealousy and irrational anger, blocked Colleen's path, accusing her of trying to steal Tad away. Colleen, confused and scared, tried to walk away, but Christa's rage escalated. Christa grabbed her, pushing her back, and the confrontation turned physical. The struggle between them intensified as Colleen tried to escape Christa's grip, but Christa was determined. Colleen was overwhelmed and unable to break free. In the chaos, Christa attacked Colleen with a blinding anger, driven by jealousy and a deep need to control the situation. Colleen, despite her best efforts to resist, was no match for Christa's fury. What began as a verbal altercation quickly became a life-changing moment for Colleen. She did not survive the encounter. Her life, once filled with promise and ambition, was abruptly and violently cut short by the very person who felt threatened by her presence. In the days leading up to January 12, 1995, Christa Pike's mind became increasingly consumed by one thought: Tad Ship. The tension between them, fueled by jealousy and obsession, was growing. Tad, another Job Corps student, was Christa's focus. She believed their bond was unique, and any perceived threat to it was unbearable. Christa had become fixated on the idea that Colleen Slemmer was trying to get close to Tad, though there was no real basis for this belief. Colleen, who had no interest in the chaos Christa had created, was simply trying to build a future for herself. But Christa's paranoia only deepened. Every encounter between Colleen and Tad, no matter how innocent, was viewed by Christa as a betrayal. She began to express more concerning thoughts to those around her, suggestions that she might harm someone, or worse, if the situation didn't change. Her words seemed like half-serious threats, but to those who were close to her, they began to seem more real. Christa's fear of losing Tad consumed her, and she started vocalizing these fears more openly. The darkness in her mind began to reveal itself. Shadala Peterson, though less vocal about the situation, was present during this escalation. As a fellow Job Corps student, Shadala was part of the dynamic but never fully involved in the breakdown happening in Christa's mind. Her silence, however, played a role in enabling Christa's growing sense of justification. Shadala didn't challenge Christa's increasingly dangerous thoughts, nor did she stop her from spiraling further into delusion. Christa began to openly talk about her desire to confront Colleen. She claimed Colleen was interfering with her relationship, and that something needed to be done about it. These thoughts, once just whispered in passing, were now frequent and direct. She made it clear that she believed something drastic was the only way to put an end to her anxiety. At the same time, she dismissed Colleen's innocence and focus on her own future. Colleen had no part in Christa's fears, yet she had become the target of them. It wasn't just about Tad anymore. It was about Christa's emotional state, and her need to exert control over a situation she couldn't accept. The more she spoke about Colleen, the more her words grew sharper. Her irrational thoughts began to take on more weight, and those who heard them were forced to wonder. How far would Christa go to protect her fragile sense of control? The walk that would take place on January 12th, 1995 wasn't just a casual stroll. It was the culmination of days of escalating tension. Christa had convinced herself that Colleen's mere presence was a threat to her relationship with Tad, and on that day, she would take action to deal with that threat.
The trio led Colleen where nobody could hear them, and then watched Christa Pike torture her for 45 minutes before finally killing her.
As she was slack,
The morning of Friday the 13th, police recovered Slemmer's tortured body behind the abandoned steam plant at the University of Tennessee. Within one day, they arrested Job Corps students Shadala Peterson, Daryl Shipp, and Christa Pike.
On January 12th, 1995, Christa Pike, Tad Shipp, and Shadala Peterson invited Colleen Slemmer to take a walk around the Job Corps campus. Colleen, unaware of the growing tension between her and Christa, agreed to join them. At this point, Colleen's only focus was on her future. She had come to Job Corps with hopes of earning her GED and starting a career. She had no interest in the drama that was brewing around her, yet she was about to become its focus. As they walked, Christa Pike began accusing Colleen of trying to interfere with her relationship with Tad. In Christa's mind, this wasn't just an innocent misunderstanding. She truly believed Colleen was a threat to her bond with him. Colleen, taken aback, tried to reassure Christa that there was no ill intention, but Christa's words grew more pointed, more accusing. Her paranoia had been festering for days, and now it was spilling over. Christa's jealousy and emotional instability fueled her words, pushing the conversation into a dangerous direction. What started as a simple accusation soon escalated. Christa accused Colleen of wanting to take Tad from her, a claim that had no foundation, but to Christa, it seemed like a threat she could no longer ignore. Colleen, startled and confused, tried to walk away, but Christa blocked her path, refusing to let her go. In that moment, something snapped in Christa. The uncontrolled emotions that had been building inside her for weeks finally erupted. Christa's frustration, mixed with jealousy and a desperate need to assert control, had reached its breaking point. She lunged toward Colleen, and in that instant the confrontation turned violent. Christa moved with intensity, fueled by an overwhelming need to regain control over the situation. Colleen, shocked by the sudden turn of events, struggled to break free. But in a moment of overwhelming tension, Christa, with the help of Tad and Shadala, restrained Colleen. The psychological pressure of the moment was heavy, and Colleen found herself caught in a situation she had never anticipated. The location of the crime, behind the agriculture campus steam plant at the University of Tennessee campus, was an isolated area with little to no chance of help. In that moment, Christa's paranoia and her belief that Colleen was an immediate threat to her relationship had clouded any rational thought. What followed was a culmination of Christa's mental unraveling, a moment that would alter the lives of all involved. Afterward,
The morning of
evidence would
Friday
tell
the
the story.
13th,
Forensic
police recovered
findings,
Slemmer's
such as
tortured
symbols
body
carved
behind
into
the
the scene,
abandoned steam
would
plant at
reveal
the University
the deeper
of
layer
Tennessee.
of Christa's disturbed mindset.
Within one day,
The fact that
they
the
arrested
crime
Job
took
Corps
place
students
in a
Shadola
secluded
Peterson,
area,
Daryl Ship,
far from
and
prying
Christa
eyes,
Pike.
emphasized how isolated and detached Christa had become from reality. What transpired on that night wasn't a random outburst of violence. It was the result of a spiraling emotional breakdown, driven by jealousy and a distorted sense of ownership over Tad. The attack was pre-planned, not an impulsive act, but a consequence of a disturbed mind that had rationalized its actions as justified. The morning of January 13th, 1995, marked the beginning of an investigation that would forever change the lives of those involved. Two University of Tennessee employees were making their routine rounds when they came upon something that would set the stage for a disturbing investigation. Behind the agriculture campus steam plant, a body was discovered, Colleen Slemmer's. The initial discovery was chilling. Colleen's body was found in a secluded area, far from any possible help. The employees immediately contacted the authorities, and the investigation began. Law enforcement officers arrived swiftly, marking the start of a process that would unravel the true extent of the crime that had taken place. The crime scene provided early clues to investigators. They observed evidence of a struggle, suggesting that Colleen had fought back. It became clear that this was no random act, but rather something targeted and intentional. The location of the body, behind a building on a remote part of campus, suggested a premeditated plan, a carefully chosen spot where the crime could unfold away from others. One of the key pieces of evidence uncovered was the presence of a symbol carved into Colleen's chest, a pentagram, which seemed to suggest that the motive behind the crime was more than just jealousy. It pointed to something darker, perhaps even a ritualistic element tied to Christa Pike's beliefs. This disturbing discovery raised questions about the deeper motivations at play. Further forensic analysis revealed more chilling details. A fragment of Colleen's skull was found later, adding another layer of unsettling evidence to the case. These findings, combined with the blood patterns found at the scene, left little doubt that Colleen had been subjected to a violent and relentless attack. As the investigation deepened, witness statements from Job Corps students began to paint a picture of Christa Pike's state of mind leading up to the attack. Several students reported hearing Christa speak about her growing anger and jealousy toward Colleen. She had expressed fears that Colleen was becoming too close to Tad's ship, and that Tad's attention was slipping away from her. Christa's paranoia had been escalating, and she had made several threats toward Colleen in the days before the attack. The breakthrough came when investigators spoke to Christa herself. She bragged openly about the crime, speaking as if it were just another event in her chaotic life. She described the moments leading up to Colleen's death, revealing a shocking lack of remorse. Christa even showed others a piece of Colleen's skull, as though it were a trophy of her actions. This behavior shocked everyone who heard about it and led investigators to focus their attention on Christa and her companions, Tad Ship and Shadala Peterson. By the end of the day, Christa, Tad, and Shadala were arrested. The investigation, fueled by forensic evidence and Christa's own statements, led to the rapid identification of the perpetrators. The details of the crime, including the strange behavior of the suspects, quickly made it clear that the murder was not a spur-of-the-moment act, but the tragic culmination of a long period of emotional instability and irrational fears. The trial of Christa Pike began with a significant focus on the overwhelming evidence against her. The prosecution's case was solid, driven by forensic findings and the chilling nature of Christa's actions. Key pieces of evidence, such as the blood patterns at the crime scene and the symbol carved into Colleen's chest, were used to show the deliberate nature of the crime. These details painted a clear picture of an attack that was pre-planned, not a spontaneous act of violence. One of the most crucial elements of the case was Christa Pike's confession. After the crime, she had openly discussed the details of what happened, showing no remorse for her actions. She even bragged about her involvement, which made her behavior all the more alarming. Witnesses testified to her disturbing attitude after the event, where she talked openly about the crime with no regard for the gravity of the situation. The prosecution also emphasized the witness statements from other Job Corps students who had heard Christa express jealousy and frustration toward Colleen. Christa had felt threatened by Colleen's presence and had vocalized her fears that Colleen was trying to get closer to Tad's ship. Her increasing paranoia and obsession became central to understanding her motive. The combination of forensic evidence, Christa's own confession, and the testimony from those around her left little room for doubt about her involvement in the crime. The defense, however, tried to shift the narrative. They argued that Christa's history of trauma, her mental health struggles, and her borderline personality disorder had shaped her actions. They presented Christa as a young woman who had been broken by her past, someone who had not fully understood the consequences of her actions. The defense sought to paint her as a victim of circumstance, someone whose actions were influenced by years of emotional turmoil and neglect. Despite this argument, the jury was unconvinced. The overwhelming evidence against Christa, combined with her lack of remorse and the bizarre behavior she exhibited after the crime, led to a swift deliberation. The jury returned a guilty verdict on first-degree murder after just a few hours of discussion. In the sentencing phase, the courtroom was filled with emotion. Colleen Slemmer's family sat silently, their grief heavy in the air as they awaited the judge's decision. Christa Pike was sentenced to death by electrocution, becoming the youngest woman ever sentenced to death in the United States at that time. The judge noted the brutal nature of the crime and the lack of remorse shown by Christa as factors in the sentencing. Christa's reaction to the verdict was emotionless. She showed no outward signs of understanding the weight of the decision. For the family of Colleen Slemmer, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but it did little to ease the pain of their loss. The court's decision made it clear that Christa Pike's actions were not just a result of a troubled past, but the result of intentional choices that had led to a senseless tragedy. As the courtroom session ended, the impact of the verdict was undeniable. The case of Christa Pike became one of the most talked about cases in the country, a reminder of the complex psychological factors at play in violent crime and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. For Colleen's family, while the verdict could never replace their loss, it marked the beginning of a long journey toward justice for their daughter. After Christa Pike was sentenced to death in 1996, she became the only female inmate on death row in Tennessee, where her case continued to capture public attention. Pike's life in prison was far from uneventful. In 2001, she attempted to strangle a fellow inmate, resulting in a charge of second-degree attempted murder. This violent incident added another disturbing layer to Pike's troubled time behind bars, demonstrating that her violent tendencies were not quelled by her incarceration. Then, in 2012, Pike attempted to escape from prison. The details of the attempt were chilling. She and other inmates tried to breach security in a bid to break out of the facility. The failed escape attempt only added to the dark narrative of Pike's time behind bars and further solidified the perception that she had not shown any signs of remorse or rehabilitation. Despite these incidents, Pike's attorneys continued to pursue appeals on her behalf, citing her mental health, age at the time of the crime, and traumatic upbringing as reasons for reconsidering her sentence. They pushed for clemency or a retrial, arguing that she was a product of her difficult past. However, the courts rejected these appeals, and Christa's sentence remained intact. Her case became a flashpoint in the debate over the death penalty, particularly with regards to juvenile offenders. Was she capable of reform, or was her crime so heinous that justice could only be served through her execution? The ongoing debate around her case raised important questions about how society should deal with mentally unstable offenders and whether a teenager should be held fully accountable for crimes committed at such a young age. As of 2025, Christa Pike's execution date was set for September 30th, 2026, further fueling public discourse over the death penalty and Pike's future. Pike remains the only female inmate on death row in Tennessee, and her case continues to provoke strong reactions. Colleen Slemmer's family has had to endure the prolonged legal battle, seeking justice for the daughter they lost in such a senseless and brutal way. As the execution date approaches, the debate around Christa Pike, her actions, her mental state, and her fate remains unresolved, with the nation watching. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the long legal battle has been a painful journey. Though the court's decision may bring closure, the emotional scars of losing a daughter in such a tragic and senseless way will never fully heal. As Christa's execution draws closer, the legacy of the crime and the questions it raised about the system will endure. The impact of Colleen Slemmer's murder reverberated deeply through her family. Her parents, who had always supported her dreams and ambitions, were left in a state of shock and disbelief. Her father, in a statement that captured the heart of their grief, said she had so much ahead of her. For Colleen's family, the loss was not just the tragic death of a young woman, but the sudden interruption of a future full of potential. They had seen in her a person who was working hard to build something positive, someone who could have contributed so much to the world. The emotional toll on Colleen's parents was immeasurable. They were forced to come to terms with the fact that their daughter's life was taken from them so suddenly, so violently, and by someone she had no reason to fear. As the case went through the legal system, their pain was compounded by the slow pace of justice and the difficult reminders of the crime that made headlines for years. Every new update on the case felt like another layer of grief for them to endure. As the legal process unfolded, the case raised broader questions about juvenile justice. Christa Pike, at 18, was not a child, but the arguments presented in her defense centered on her age at the time of the crime. Some believed that her mental health and traumatic upbringing should be taken into account, questioning whether someone so young should be held accountable as an adult for such a severe act. The case forced society to examine how young offenders are treated within the justice system, and whether they should be subject to the same consequences as adults, especially when mental illness is a factor. In addition to the debates on juvenile justice, the case also highlighted the importance of mental health in understanding violent crime. Christa Pike's background, filled with abuse and neglect, led many to wonder whether different interventions could have prevented such a tragic outcome. While the defense argued that Christa's upbringing contributed to her actions, others felt her choices, particularly in how she handled her jealousy and paranoia, should not be excused. The case also raised unsettling questions about the influence of ideology. In this case, Christa's apparent interest in the occult. Was this just a phase, or did it play a role in her descent into violence? The symbolism at the crime scene and Christa's actions after the crime suggested that her beliefs were tangled with her emotions in a way that blurred the line between reality and fantasy. As the case progressed, it reflected much larger societal issues: the intersection of mental health, youth crime, and societal expectations of responsibility. Colleen's murder and the investigation that followed became a focal point for conversations on how society addresses the complexities of mental health, especially in young people, and how the justice system should respond to those struggling with psychological issues. Christa Pike's actions forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about punishment and rehabilitation, questions that remain at the heart of many contemporary debates about the justice system. Colleen's family continues to carry the weight of their loss, while Christa Pike's case remains a controversial and emotional symbol of the difficult balance between justice, accountability, and mercy. As the execution date approaches, the conversation about her fate continues to provoke deep reflection on the death penalty and its place in modern society. Christa Pike is the youngest woman on death row in Tennessee. But does she deserve to be there? I'm torn. On one hand, she's a product of an utterly broken system, a disturbed teenager with a history of abuse and mental illness. On the other hand, she brutally murdered someone in cold blood and showed no remorse. So here's the real question. Do we really care about mental health in the justice system, or is the only thing that matters the severity of the crime? Why do we hold criminals like Christa to a different standard when their actions are rooted in deep psychological trauma? Should the death penalty be about punishing evil, or should it be about understanding the root cause? This case has me questioning everything. Should we be trying to rehabilitate the broken, or just lock them away and throw away the key? Thank you for sticking with us until the end of this story. If you found this one compelling, you won't want to miss the next. It's just as gripping, and even more surprising. Click the image on your screen now to watch the next chapter.